This week's readings are on social theory, and theory is difficult. Theory can be really challenging to wrap your head around. And this week in particular, it's the longest week in terms of chapters. It's the longest week in terms of just straight up like raw number of pages. And you're reading some old stuff, some things from thinkers that you might have never heard of. This may very well be your first exposure to Marx or Weber or Durkheim, and their writing is not the easiest to digest. I call it slow food. I've been doing this for a really long time, and even after all of that experience, reading Marx can be really challenging. And so I encourage you to be patient with yourself as you embark on this material, knowing that you're going to need a little more time, and be patient with the material itself. There are some really powerful ideas in the folks that we're reading this week, and if you try to rush through it, you're not going to get it. And that's important not only for comprehending this week's readings, but certainly for the final exam, it's going to be really important that you've got a really great grasp on these ideas. So that said, why theory? Why should we study theory? Why should we care? And I think the answer is pretty simple, and it's part of why there are theoretical sociologists, people who write and read theory as their sort of focus within the field. Social theory is a set of interrelated ideas that allow for the systematization of knowledge of the social world. And through that knowledge, the explanation of that social world and predictions about the future of a given social world. When we're talking about social theory, we're talking about sort of a bigger set of ideas. So we're not talking about postulations you make about your family. We're talking about things that generally stand the test of time, right? That can be tested and validated time and time again, and that have a wide range of applications, right? That a particular set of theories can be utilized in varying settings. Also, generally, when we're talking about social theory, we're talking about ideas that deal with critical, important social issues, right? So oftentimes we're thinking about scales. So we're thinking about ideas that relate to communities, to institutions, to entire societies. Sometimes social theory is also inspired by careful study of other theorists. So ideas don't just come from me sitting here at my dining room table. Theories come from having read other theorists, having read other pieces of research, and in that analysis, in that study, gleaning new pieces of wisdom, new avenues of inquiry, new questions, new postulations about the world. Social theory also, like any other kind of theory, relies on data. And so sometimes there's a debate in sociology over methods and over theory, over the people wrestling over what matters more than what other piece of the discipline. And the reality is that theory and methods are deeply interrelated. Theories are backed by empirical evidence. Empirical evidence generalized to social theories. And so one cannot really exist without the other. The other piece, too, the final piece, is that social theories can be critically analyzed and validated by empirical research. And so it's not simply that I have this idea and I throw it out there and it's a social theory because I say it is, but rather that a set of theories about the world are tested against empirical evidence, tested against real life situations and scenarios, and tested against the world as we live it and as we experience it. In sociology, we generally teach three sort of classical founding theories: functionalism or structural functionalism, symbolic interactionism, and conflict theory. And we teach them in part because each of them are associated with sort of the kind of consensus founders of sociology: Emil Durkheim, Max Weber, and Karl Marx. these are not the only theories, right? These are not the only ways of explaining the world. And theories, just like anything else, are deeply social, right? They emerge out of particular social, institutional, cultural contexts. And so these theories are very much a product of their time, and you see that even in just the style in which they're written. But they continue to have long-standing resonance that creeps into the contemporary moment, even though we have contemporary social theorists that have taken some of these ideas and kind of run with it in new and different and interesting directions, right? So we have post-structuralist theorists, we have postmodernist theories, and those are sort of related. We have feminist theories, we have critical race theories, right? There are different avenues, different veins of theorizing, but these three are considered kind of foundational and classical. And the texts that are sort of generally associated with these three theorists, which you sort of get a sampling of this week, are still widely read, not only in Soc101, but at the graduate level. That people continue to debate Karl Marx's Das Kapital, which is sort of his magnum opus. So even though we can understand these theories as classical, we can leverage critiques of them, most certainly. We can think about how we might update them. They continue to have powerful resonance today. So we'll start with structural functionalism, which is oftentimes associated with Emile Durkheim. Functionalism sort of assumes that the world is objectively real, which means that there is a tangible, real world out there. And believe me, in the realm of philosophy, people debate that. People debate whether or not there is an objectively real world. But structural functionalists assume there is. And because it is objectively real, we can employ research techniques to understand it. Surveys, interviews, whatever. There are techniques to interact with and make sense of the world. And structural functionalists like Durkheim understood societies to be like organisms, right? Like a human body comprised of different institutions and different components that work in harmony to keep a society going. So functionalists oftentimes ask questions like, which needs must be met for a social system to exist? How do institutions satisfy those needs? What do societies do to maintain homeostasis, right? And homeostasis, when we're talking biologically, is sort of like equilibrium, balance amongst the systems. And functionalists also assume that because societies are these sort of organisms, changes in one institution or one portion lead to changes in another, right? Because these systems are interrelated. And so because societies are these kinds of organisms that are always striving for homeostasis, functionalists oftentimes think of individuals as decision makers, right? So they're agents, they still make choices, but they're agents whose choices are predictable given their location within a particular social structure and the norms and expectations that they've internalized, right, that they've been socialized in, if you remember back to last week, due to that sort of location within a particular society or within a particular system. And so those are sort of like the basic kind of foundational premises of structural functionalism. Now, by and large, sociologists have moved away from this branch of theory in part because we've realized that there is no single, uniform, generalizable theory about societies, right? What might be functional in one society is not in another, and so we can't propose one single kind of unifying theory of structural functionalism, of what is structurally functional for any sort of human organization. And so it becomes really tricky. Nonetheless, there are sort of social theorists who are striving, who are looking for these kinds of laws, right? These hard and fast and surefire ways of understanding the world. But sociology, by and large, has moved away from that. And that kind of hinges on the social constructedness of social life. Or rather, that's redundant, the social constructedness of human experience. If our lives are inflected by social organizations, by social institutions, by culture, well then it becomes nearly impossible, right, to offer a generalizable law, generalizable theory of that by which we could understand all societies and all groups of people across all periods in time. And the other thing that I think is interesting and worth noting when we're talking about functionalism is this idea of homeostasis. Homeostasis presumes that that when a system is operating, that it is therefore operating optimally. And we might ask, right? We might ask a structural functionalist, well, is slavery, for example, right? If we're thinking about a colonial society, is slavery functional, right? Well, within sort of the economy of the South, right? Slavery was most certainly functional, but if you asked the enslaved, they would disagree, right? They would argue that no, slavery is an abhorrent institution, right? A dehumanizing, violent, brutal institution, right? So this question of what does it mean for a society to be functioning optimally, it gets really tricky. But if we assume that societies are organisms, then we don't have inroads to ask that kind of question. The next branch, symbolic interactionism, is most often associated with Max Weber and Erving Goffman, who I made passing reference to a couple of weeks ago. Symbolic interactionists are concerned less with macro level institutional societal things and more with micro level person to person, peer to peer, individual to individual interactions. And so the symbolic interactionists presume that humans are sort of pragmatic actors who constantly adjust their behavior relative to the behaviors of other people. And we make these adjustments in part because we are able to interpret the actions of others, right? So we're in our day-to-day lives making these minor, on-the-fly, oftentimes subconscious adjustments so that we can have these pleasant and appropriate interactions in our day-to-day life. One of the when I explain this to students, one of the clips that I love to play is of President Obama. President Obama was visiting a basketball team, and he's making his way down the line, greeting the players and the coaches. And with the two white coaches, he extends his hands and sort of shakes it formally. And with the black players, he gives them dap. That is sort of emblematic of symbolic interactionism, right? These sort of micro level changes, these performative changes that we make in order to have our interactions be sort of passable and not sort of put us at odds with our social environment. Symbolic interactionists, social life is sort of comprised of interactions, right? These micro, sometimes fleeting interactions between people. And because our social interactions are comprised of these micro moments, this sort of everyday minutia, social relations, according to this theory, are in constant flux. And they're constantly changing dependent upon how we interpret interactions, how we interpret the actions of other people, and how we ourselves act in our day-to-day lives. And this, of course, is at odds with the functionalist perspective, which argues that that socialization, rather than creating flux, actually creates stability in social systems. And again, symbolic interactionism and functionalism are sort of theories of totally different scales, but this is sort of one of the ways where we can see that they're not easily reconciled. And today, in sort of contemporary sociology, there continue to be people who focus on micro level interactions and others who focus on macro level structural things. That isn't to say that that those things don't interact or don't relate to one another, or that there aren't theories that allow us to tether those two realms of social life together, but rather that just people have their focuses and their interests, and tend to sort of hone in on one particular area or arena of social life. The last classical theory is conflict theory, and we generally associate this with Marx. I won't say too much just yet, in part because I'm going to allot Marx a bigger chunk of time later in the lecture. But suffice it to say that sort of the core principles of conflict theory are that the sort of biggest mover and shaper of history of social life is the class conflict over limited resources. Now, Durkheim, Marx, and Weber have these massive theories, these rich and complex theories about the social world. Um, but we, in our day-to-day lives, theorize all the time, right? We take in data and stimuli and make suppositions of the world, make assumptions of the world, and we use those assumptions to sort of guide our decision making and our choices, and those ideas allow us to navigate um, our world and at a day-to-day level. Um, One of the things that and this is especially true if you grew up in the United States, one of the things that we've been socialized to believe is that inequality is kind of just normal. It is the way it is. The fact that some people are rich and some people are poor, the fact that some people go to really good schools and other people go to poor schools, the fact that some people are healthy and others are not. We take these things, these differences, as just the facts of life. And in fact, in some of your papers, some of your first papers, a number of you sort of made that argument that social inequalities are just kind of the fact of life. They will always exist. They have always existed, and there's not a ton that we can do about it. Those are sort of like the facts of life, as it were. Um, well, Davis and Moore take that same position from a sociological perspective. They argue that no society is classless, that regardless of where you're looking, there's some people who have more than others. And for them, stratification, that hierarchical organization of people where some have more than others, where some have more prestige, where some have more power, have more political sway, whatever, where there's a group that controls disproportionately the sort of social resources, they argue that organization, that stratification, is functionally necessary for society, right? And if we think back to Durkheim, what they're suggesting is that societies cannot work, cannot operate without having a stratified system. And from their perspective, every society has to motivate people to fill important positions, and once in those positions, has to sort of inculcate in them the desire to perform its duties. And one of the ways that societies do this um, is by ensuring that the most important positions are continuously filled by the most qualified persons, right? And in order to do that, those positions have to come with disproportionate prestige, esteem, money, etc. Right? And we can think of those resources in a number of ways, right? Oftentimes, we're thinking just immediately of money, right? There are positions that cut a bigger check relative to others, but there's also social prestige, right? The sort of the social capital that you get by virtue of having a particular job, a particular occupation, right? When I tell people I'm a professor at Syracuse University, that lands one way. When I tell people I'm a wrestling coach, which I am, that's another job of mine, that lands in a totally different way. And it's because those positions have different kind of prestige, right? We value them differently in society. We think of professors as intellectuals. We think of them as cultured. We think of them oftentimes as well paid. More often than not, that's not actually true. Whereas coaches, we don't think of coaching in the same way. We don't think of that as a particularly cerebral position, despite that, like, Nick Saban is the greatest football mind ever. We don't think of coaching as particularly cerebral, as not requiring particular kinds of training and talent. right? And so different positions have different kinds of prestige associated with them. And so even though we can think of money and benefits and salaries and 401ks and insurance as the kind of benefits of a particular position, there are other benefits too that are more psychological, that are deeply social. And so again, societies have to find a way of not only getting people to fill those positions, but keeping them there. And in order to get people to fill those critical positions, well, they need to reap disproportionate rewards. And as Davis and Moore see it, some positions are sort of inherently better than others, by their very design better than others. Some positions require special talents and training, and others are more functionally important than other positions, right? And so it's these differences in these occupations that necessitates, as they see it, these social inequalities, right? The stratification of social positions. Thus, they argue, societies need to find the right kind of rewards for each position and a way of distributing those rewards accordingly, right? And so, and the rewards again are different. In some cases, it's right. It's just a paycheck. It's just money. In some cases, it's the ability to travel or things like bonuses. Again, prestige and ego boost, right? The things that give us social cachet. So that's their argument. That's sort of the quick and dirty of their argument. Stratification is functionally necessary, and societies have to distribute rewards differently so that the most important positions are filled by the most qualified people. And I think that if you've grown up in the U.S. and certainly the West, you read that and you kind of think, wow, okay, that makes sense. I can explain why a carpenter makes less than a lawyer by looking at these arguments. But we have Tuman, who in the very same article offers a kind of countervening position, and starts to poke holes in what at first feels like a really sort of solid theory of social inequality. So the first thing is that Tuman points out is that we take for granted social inequalities. We assume that because they're so pervasive, that they're also timeless, and inevitable. And we also, again, frequently assume that they're positively functional, right? That they contribute to the positive functioning of society. But the truth is that, and if you've been following along, if you've been keeping up with the reading, if you've been following the course so far, you'll see that we've actually been socialized and habituated to these social inequalities, right? When you grow up in a particular social arrangement, when you grow up in a particular culture, well, those things start to seem normal. You don't question them. You don't poke holes in the founding logic. You kind of take them as a given. You take them as true, as inherent. And it is actually, in fact, precisely that notion that they're inherent, that they're normal, that allows them to be sustained. When we think of things as normal, when we think of them as given, when we normalize things, we don't question them, right? We take it as our daily bread. And it is through normalization that social systems get sustained, right? And most certainly social inequalities. So the first piece, the first sort of critique that Tuman brings is that suggesting that certain positions are functionally important or more important than others presumes and validates the status quo. And the status quo is another way of saying the way things are. When we say that one position is more important than another, that always already assumes the current and present social arrangement, the current architecture of a particular society. What we fail to recognize is that our society at any given moment is one possible arrangement of many. And societies have change and will continue to change sort of along this sort of endless time, sort of spectrum of time. We will continue to progress forward. New technologies will be invented. New people will be born. Others will die. New structures and scandals. Societies are constantly evolving because human beings are constantly evolving. But when we say that one position, that one job is functionally important to a society, we're only assuming and validating the status quo. We're not recognizing that societies can change and sometimes should change, right? That societies should change such that one particular position will start to seem less functionally necessary, and maybe another will take its place. So that's one piece, right? That the assumption of a functional necessity always assumes the status quo, always defends the status quo. Now, Davis and Moore, they're really concerned with talent. In their piece, they're concerned with how do we find and recruit the most talented people and get them to not only fill in those necessary positions but stay there. Well, what Davis argues is that the more rigidly stratified a society, which means the harder it is for you to move up in a society, move up that proverbial ladder, the less likely it is for a society to discover, foster, and bring to fruition the talents of its members. Stratification, by design, builds obstacles to further exploration of the range of available talents. If social inequalities are passed down from generation to generation, then the stratification system is dysfunctional and limits the discovery and recruitment and training of new talent. So what does all of that mean? That means that the harder it is for folks to move up in the social ladders, the harder it is for the most talented people to rise to the top, for the most talented people to fill those supposedly desirable and demanding positions, and in turn reap the rewards of those positions, right? You might be the single greatest civil engineer ever. That might be sort of like just in your brain, right? You have this gift for engineering, let's say. But if you are the product of a very stratified society, the likelihood of you going to a good school is greatly diminished. The likelihood of you going to a university after having graduated from that poor school is that much more diminished. And then the likelihood of you pursuing an advanced engineering degree, right? You can just see that percentage sort of dripping and dripping and dripping and dripping away. So that even if you're talented, it doesn't matter, right? Because there's so many roadblocks to your ascent up that ladder. Now here, all of these authors, Davis and Moore and Tuman, are offering, or they're writing from the vantage point of social theory, right? They're giving us these kind of ideal types and these models, and so it's useful to make things concrete. So here in the United States, public education is funded through property tax. What that means is that in communities where homes are valued higher, they are able to better fund those public schools, right? So in two communities, you might have two houses that are structurally, architecturally the same, but because they're in different neighborhoods, they're valued differently, right? And so what ends up happening is that in neighborhoods where the property is valued lower than in others, they have poorer, less well-funded schools. So what's happened here in the United States is that we have a long history of racial segregation, a long, violent, vicious history of racial segregation. After the Second World War, we had the GI Bill, and the GI Bill essentially helped veterans finance collegiate educations, their collegiate education, finance small businesses, And it gave them access to low interest, federally backed mortgages. It used to be prior to the 1940s that when you mortgaged a home, you put 50% down and you paid the rest over 10 years. Well, in the wake of the GI Bill, we radically changed our mortgages so that people were putting 10% down on homes and then paying it off over 30 years, right? So GIs, veterans, were coming back from the Second World War, and they were able to buy homes at incredibly low prices with very, very, very small down payments. And that essentially that program essentially subsidized the creation of a middle class, because you had folks, again, coming back from the war, who were buying homes for the first time, who were financing education for the first time, who were starting businesses for the first time. But the folks who were locked out were African Americans. African Americans were locked out of these low interest, federally backed mortgages. And so what ended up happening is that while white families were accruing wealth through home ownership, African Americans were effectively locked out. And banks were using what we call redlining. They would have these maps of neighborhoods, and they would redline African American neighborhoods and basically deem them too risky to issue loans. And so while white families are reaping the rewards of these changes in the economy, of these new federal initiatives, African Americans are kind of like just totally locked out. When black families would speak to real estate agents, they'd get steered towards black neighborhoods, right? They wouldn't be shown homes in white neighborhoods because real estate agents feared that black families moving in would depreciate the value of those homes. Now, let's be clear. It's not that black people, by virtue of being black, depreciate homes, but rather that black people themselves are devalued, and their presence is seen as depreciating the value of homes, right? The value of a home is deeply social, right? Even though we measure it in dollars and cents. And so these black families were steered away from white neighborhoods. And even when we started outlawing these redlining practices, and black families for the first time had access to like suburban homes, what would happen is that real estate agents would engage in the act of block busting. So they would go to white families and say, hey, look, a black family moved in 3 blocks down, you should sell. Because if you sell later, right, if you don't sell now, what's going to happen is that the value of your home is going to go down, and you're going to lose money on your investment. And white families, in a panic, would sell. They would sell their homes at below market value, hoping to recuperate as much of their investment as possible. And they would move out of those communities. And those same real estate agents would then turn around and sell those very same homes at above market value to black families who were desperate to purchase a home and to start accruing wealth. This white flight devastated communities in no small part because it eroded the tax base. So as white families left those communities, the value of those homes, now sold to black families at inflated prices, started to depreciate. So what happens is 2 things. One, you have black families who are now unable to build wealth through home ownership, which here in the United States is the chief mechanism for building wealth. And so families are locked out of building wealth, but their social services start to atrophy, chiefly education. So we have public school systems that have never recovered from those decades, that are severely, punishingly, brutally underfunded, and that underfunding has adverse consequences for the children who graduate from those institutions. So let's bring this back to Tuman's rebuttal to Davis and Moore. when you have a history like that, right? When we take into account the history of segregation, of home ownership, and its links to education, well, then it becomes a little easier to see how rigidly stratified our society has been along the vector of race and class. Um, a student who's been the product of a school system like that is not in a position to have their talents bear fruit, because an impoverished school system does not position you to go to college. And if you're not going to college, well, then what are the odds of you getting an engineering degree, a law degree, a medical degree, etc.? Right? So you can see people's shots, people's chances at lucrative, prestigious positions shrinking rapidly. Um, and in the case, in the U.S. case, those disadvantages are reproduced intergenerationally, because if your home did not allow you to build wealth, and your children have gone to underfunded public schools and have not had the opportunity to move up the socioeconomic ladder through education, well, then your grandchildren will inherit those same inequalities, right? They'll go to those same schools, right? They'll be trapped in that same community, right? Unable to better themselves, to better their community, to ascend the supposed ladder. I'm offering a decades worth of history compressed into a few moments for the sake of example. But suffice it to say, again, Tubin's rebuttal is that rigidly stratified societies do not allow for the discovery of talent. And when social inequalities are passed down from generation to generation, we find that social inequalities are dysfunctional because they set limits to the discovery, recruitment, and training of talent. Davis and Moore also argue that part of the reason certain occupations should be rewarded disproportionately is because of the sacrifices made to attain the training required to hold that position. Take medicine, for example, right? You have to go to school for a very long time, right? And that's a time where you forego earning what you could be earning otherwise in order to be trained appropriately to be a doctor, to then, according to their model, reap the immense rewards of being a medical professional. Well, what Tuman kind of counters is things that I imagine a great deal of you, or I hope rather that a great deal of you will recognize, and it's that the training, the cost of training is oftentimes borne by parents. Parents, in the simplest terms, more often than not, help children pave their way through a collegiate education, be it either through outright paying those bills and fronting the cost, or subsidizing loans, or paying for some other tangential expenses. Parents are oftentimes deeply involved in the training, right, of attaining a college degree. And in theory, right, a collegiate degree is in fact just that, right, training for a particular profession or particular occupation. And so that those resources, the resources that allow a family to pay for a child to go to college, are actually a reward that comes from an already stratified society, right? So you can see how those inequalities get reproduced. The very same families that on one end are locked out of climbing the ladder because inequalities are passed down from one generation to the other are able to have that status reproduced for their children as they pass those resources up and up and up and up and up across the generations, right? So that same compounding effect works in both directions, where a family is able to reproduce either the rewards of their social position or reproduce the disadvantages of their social position. Tuman also argues that while these college students don't generally make a living, their status as college students does offer some rewards. So oftentimes college students are not starting families, right? They're not working. They're not having to pay for a dependent. And so they can defer some of the costs and the taxations and the burdens of adulthood. Additionally, there's also a kind of prestige to being a college student. I mean, oftentimes young people are dismissed as young and dumb, and et cetera, idealistic, and those things oftentimes hinge on age. But odds are that no one's disparaged you for pursuing a collegiate education. In fact, people appreciate and and sing the praises of folks who pursue higher education. Finally, being a collegiate student also affords you leisure and freedom not afforded to those who work, who for whatever reason forego going to college and go right into the workforce. Um, Odds are that at no other time in your life are you going to be uh, asked to read and to write and to submit lab reports. And of course, that's work of a certain sort. Um, but it certainly affords you a great deal of free time, right? It's colleges or institutions that are oftentimes marked by uh, the campus cultures of partying, of drinking, of drug use, of sex, etc. Right? We can think of those as leisurely activities, and we use that word here loosely, that are a benefit of being a college student. Um, and so those are sort of three of Tuman's kind of core rebuttals to why stratification is dysfunctional to societies, and he adds a handful of I guess kind of secondary rebuttals as well. He argues that stratified systems reward those who abide by norms, by social norms, and punish those who don't. They also grant elites the political power necessary to get others to accept their ideology, to accept the idea that this particular position is valuable and this other position is not, that this position should be lavishly rewarded while this other position should not. And those ideologies, right, those ways of seeing the world invariably end up rationalizing the status quo as logical, as natural, as moral, and in turn reproduce that very system. Um, this next one's also really important. Stratified societies distribute favorable self-images unequally. Uh, Certain groups come to see themselves as undeserving, as unfit, as less favorable. And this is why, when we're talking about popular culture, people oftentimes say that representation matters, because getting to see yourself reflected in society is important. And here Tuman's arguing that it's actually necessary to get people to be creative and to be generative, is to see yourself reflected back to you in society. But a stratified society does not allow those who sit on the lower rungs to get that self-image back. It also encourages hostility, suspicion, and distrust of the less privileged. Think about the people who we think of as dangerous in our popular consciousness. Think about the groups that we disparage on the evening news. Those are overwhelmingly the folks who sit on the bottom rungs of that social hierarchy. And of course, that creates, that leads to violence, that leads to disproportionate incarceration rates, et cetera, right? That dynamic of hostility, of suspicion, of distrust does not lubricate the pathway for folks to ascend from those lower rungs. And relatedly, it creates an unequal sense of significant membership and loyalty and motivation to participate. So folks end up feeling like they are secondary or tertiary citizens in their society, and therefore don't feel any impetus to contribute meaningfully to the societies in which they belong in. So now, of course, Davis and Moore and Tuman are three thinkers, and we see in this piece an exchange of ideas, a kind of intellectual debate, and this is oftentimes where the way in which academics wrestle. It's rarely in a kind of face-to-face, in part because, right, social scientists are all over the world, but it's in this sort of exchange of papers, and if you pick up a journal, you'll see these kind of these rebuttals and these replies exchange between academics. But the point here is to get us to think about how the power of theory, and what theory allows us to do. Right? We could use theory to validate social norms, to lend credence to our existing social arrangements. We can also use social theory to critique it, to leverage challenges, to point us to new avenues that allow us to see the things that we take as that we take for granted in a new light. And it begs the question: is stratification socially functional? Do we have should we pursue a truly equal society? What might that look like? In you know when we look at debates between Republicans and Democrats in the U.S., there's this debate about um, equality of opportunity versus equality of result. Right? Are those meaningful differences? These are important questions that we should be wrestling with, that we should be pursuing. In part because the job of a sociologist is to make sense of social problems, and social problems invariably create inequalities. And so we should constantly be asking ourselves, um, what are the parameters of inequalities? How do they manifest? And what purpose do they serve in a given society? Karl Marx has got to be one of the most commonly referenced social theorists. Um, Certainly, I mean, in the social sciences, he's referenced all of the time. We debate his ideas constantly still. Um, but even in popular discourse, I think people think they know what Marx said, but more often than not, they don't. And so what's happened is that Marx is, I think, one of the most cited but most reviled, and misunderstood thinkers, um, kind of ever. In part because we've associated his ideas with the failures of communist and socialist regimes in the 20th century. Um, that's not stuff that we're going to get into here. Frankly, we just don't have the time. And the reality is that for us to really engage with um, Marx's ideas and communism as it's been practiced would require us to take an entirely separate class devoted to Marx to really have something viable and meaty to discuss. Um, for now, you've read, hopefully, the Manifesto, which is one of his most well-known works, and you've read a bit from the Ritzer text that kind of gives a broad summary of some of the folks that we're thinking about. I want to make this very clear. This is a sampling of Marx's ideas that we're going to be covering in very, very, very broad strokes. I encourage you to debate this, to raise questions in the Discord, but know that this lecture, this bit that I'm going to devote to Marx, will in no way suffice, and will certainly should not be taken as the final or definitive word about Marx. It's really merely introductory and summational at that. Marx deserves understanding Marx more completely deserves more than we can give him in this class, and certainly more than I can give him in this snippet. So know that as we move through. Again, and I say this, I give this caution because Marx has been and continues to be this kind of really polarizing thinker. So Marx argues that the central force of history is the history of class struggle. And in capitalist societies, that struggle is between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, between the capitalist class and the working class. The capitalist class controls the means of production and exploits the working class, who have to sell their labor in order to reproduce themselves. Right? They subsist on wages, while the capitalists turn a profit using the labor of the working class. What happens is that this exploitative relationship concentrates wealth and property in the hands of the capitalists, despite the fact that, according to Marx, labor is the only thing that creates value. So what happens? Workers are then alienated from their work, right? They become these kind of automatons who are who are in a factory, pressing a particular piece of metal and sending it on down the line, and pressing the next piece and sending it on down the line, right? So they become alienated from their work, and each other. And so what happens is that because capitalists control the means of production and the products themselves, workers become less human, right? And for Marx, what you do, your work, your labor, is central to what makes you a person. And so what happens is that these capitalist labor relations turn people into machines, right? Again, alienate them from their work and from their coworkers, in a way that's detrimental to human potential. And so invariably, these exploitative conditions will lead to the working class getting organized as communists, and this communist group will seek to unite the working class and overthrow the capitalist class. Again, this is the spark notes of all spark notes versions of Marx. Now, what's the goal of the communists? Well, they seek to abolish private property, which, as they see it, is central, and certainly as Marx sees it, is central to class exploitation. Now, what does that mean? Because I think oftentimes this is a piece of Marx's ideas that people take to mean, well, you don't get to own anything, you don't get to have anything. I don't get to I just don't have anything that's mine. And that's not what he's suggesting. Marx argues that short of artisanal kind of self-made property, there is no, right now in capitalist society, there is no true private property. Capitalism creates property by the hands of laborers, a conglomerate of laborers who have no say over what happens to it, and it then gets sold by the capitalist class for a profit. Thus, as Marx sees it, capital is a collective product that has social rather than individual power. So as he sees it, the means of production are already collective. And what we need to do is to do away with the control of the means of production at the hands of the capitalist class and turn that control over to the working class, which comprise the vast majority of the world as he sees it. Now, and this is to sort of further refine his take. Communists rather don't seek to abolish the personal appropriation of the products of one's own labor, right? Those things that you make with your own hands. Rather, they seek to rid society of the system wherein the laborer exists only to increase capital and is paid a wage that simply allows him to reproduce his labor, right? A wage that gives him just enough to get up in the morning, and go to her job and work, and then sort of repeat that cycle over and over again. So that's the manifesto condensed into 5 minutes. For Marx, the class conflict is the central engine of history. It's the thing that moves and shakes and shapes societies. And as he sees it, capitalist relationships are inherently exploitative, and lead to crisis. There's more that can be said there. There's certainly more that Marx says in the manifesto itself. I think he has interesting things to say about colonialism. He points, interestingly, to differences of race. He has interesting things to say about the middle class, that are not, for the sake of this lecture, worth elaborating, but I hope you bring to bear in the comments, in the Discord. Is communism as we understand it from the manifesto, is it viable? Why isn't it? Why is it? Why might we venture to guess that communist regimes, communist governments have failed in the 20th century? What critiques might Marx himself offer of those governments? These are all questions that are worth wrestling with, that are worth offering up for debate in the Discord. So I encourage you to do just that. Again, Marx is tricky to understand, and if you're interested in his ideas, I'm happy to throw out some further reading for obviously not for the class, but for individuals to keep chewing on. Again, so we can tie him back to conflict theory, and he's seen as kind of the forefather of conflict theory, and his ideas have continued to challenge and shape social theory for decades now, and I imagine will continue to do so for a very, very long time. Now, I have to make sure that I emphasize this. It's pronounced Weber. Every year I get someone saying Weber, and of course, um, that's how it's spelled, so it's easy to make the mistake. It's a German surname, so yeah, Max Weber. He's the author of The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, and he, like Marx, is looking at capitalist societies. And right there, these are men who are writing, um, who are products of their time, who are really deeply concerned with the parameters of capitalism and what capitalism looks like and how it takes shape, what force it exerts, how it changes or has changed. And in Weber's case, he's asking how it's emerged, um, and and he's asking, he's looking at other faith traditions, and asking why is it that given the similarities between some of these different groups, why is it that capitalism developed in the way that it did in the West? And what he argues is that it's the product of a cultural shift, right? So Calvinists and Puritans, right, these two Christian sects believed in predestination, meaning that your place in heaven or hell was predetermined, was already sealed in place. And there was no way to change your fate, but you could discern the will of God, as it were. You could discern if you were saved by your success in business. So it became imperative within Calvinist belief to concern yourself with success in business, because success in business meant salvation. Um, and so these groups emphasize frugality, right? Being saving and being judicious and conservative with your money, reinvesting your money in new businesses and new ventures, and also avoiding kind of frivolous personal pleasure and personal expenses. And so what this did was it introduced an ethical imperative to economic success, and in turn, and this is key, a justification, an ethical and moral justification to inequalities. Right? Without this Protestant ethic, the pursuit of money seems antithetical to Christian belief. Right? It violates this sort of this latent tenet against greed. Right? That's kind of at the heart of a lot of faith traditions. But when your pursuit of business is sanctioned religiously, right, then it gives it this kind of ethical and moral imperative. Therefore, right, what you end up with is a culture, a system, a society whereby economic success becomes an ethical imperative, right, and the lack of success becomes a sign of your own demise, right, of your own, then gets perceived as a personal failure, an individual failure, right? Because once you do away with the religious stipulations, once you do away with that sort of the Calvinist and Puritan scaffolding that holds up the Protestant ethic, you're still left with this belief. And so rather than economic and business failure being attributed to eternal damnation, it now gets attributed to personal and individual failures, right? And so what Weber's pointing us towards is the sort of ethos, right? The spirit of capitalism, the ideology that animates capitalist societies, right? The symbolic interactionist component that's central to to the structural component that Marx outlines for us. And what happens is, if we follow this line of thought, what we end up with is a society where we attribute social inequalities to individual failures rather than the structure or architecture of a particular society. And what ends up happening then, right, if we follow the sort of line of thinking logically, is that the solution to those problems aren't about government funding, they're not about passing new social initiatives, they're not about restructuring a society, but rather about an individual pulling themselves up by their proverbial bootstraps, right? That idea remains central to American ideology, to American identity. The notion that anybody who commits themselves to hard work can attain success is central to the American dream. If you've grown up here, if you've lived here for long enough, what I'm saying to you should be deeply resonant. Those ideas are very much animated by the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism. And those ideologies are precisely how we are socialized to invest in these systems rather than question them. It's part of how social systems get replicated and continue to impact and influence and structure our day-to-day lives. Now, the inclusion of W.E.B. Du Bois as one of the three sociologists that I'm having you read sort of directly from seems kind of odd because Du Bois, first of all, Du Bois is American, whereas Weber and Marx are both European. And importantly, Du Bois is African American, and he's not writing about capitalism, or at least not directly. I include Du Bois for a litany of reasons. The first of which is, making a class requires making choices. And when you're faced with a 6-week summer session course, it becomes that much more critical to make cuts in the syllabus somewhere. Typically, when we're teaching theory, we have students read, Marx, Weber, Durkheim, and maybe Freud and a handful of others. And if it's a theory course, of course, you'd sample more widely. I'm throwing Du Bois here in part because I think he's an important forefather of American sociology more specifically. He was born at Great Barrington, Massachusetts, and I think his work on race in the United States, his theories on race in the United States, continue to be deeply resonant in much the same way that Marx and Weber and Durkheim's ideas continue to hold a great deal of resonance. Du Bois was the first African American man to graduate from Harvard, and he got an appointment and a position rather at Penn. Again, another incredibly prestigious university. And because of the racism of the time, Du Bois wasn't even granted the title of professor. I think he wasn't even granted the title of lecturer, if I remember the history correctly. And Du Bois, despite his intellectual prowess, despite his incredible accomplishments, was sort of cast aside at Penn. Nonetheless, Du Bois went on to become an incredibly prolific writer, an incredibly important thinker. Out of his time at Penn, he produced the Philadelphia Negro, which was, a monumental undertaking, an incredible piece of research about Black life in Philadelphia at the time. He was an incredibly important member of the Harlem Renaissance, this massive cultural movement in the 1920s as a result of the Great Migration out of the South into the North, the Northeast, and then the out West. And in many ways, Social Black Folk is kind of his magnum opus, or at very least the work that he's most recognized for. And it is it's in many ways a tour de force. He takes on a number of different topics and ideas over the course of that text, and for our purposes, we've only read of our spiritual strivings, the opening chapter there. And one of the reasons that I offer it is not only because of Du Bois's significance to American sociology, but because I think of the connections, the deep and rich connections that his work has to Jordan Peele's Get Out, a film that garnered Peele a great deal of praise and acclaim, and a film that I think has been widely discussed in the popular consciousness, but has not been discussed sociologically, or at least not in this way. So I hope not only to introduce you to Du Bois's ideas and his theorizing, but to get you to see that we can theorize all the time, and that theory allows us to tether these really, really rich and important connections all of the time. And in fact, that theory might allow us to produce art, and through art leverage different kinds of critiques. And so we'll start with Du Bois, and then I'll move into the film itself to elaborate on the connections that are there. Du Bois says a lot in this chapter, but I think that his it all comes back to actually things that he says in the first few pages. He argues that African Americans come to negotiate the veil of racism. Right, and if you think about a veil is we oftentimes associate them with brides, right? It's a piece of cloth that might allow the wearer to see well out, but obscures the face and the features of the person wearing the veil. And so what that means is that African Americans are constantly having to know who they are, and to know themselves in their own sort of complex subjecthood, but also are having to constantly negotiate how they're perceived by whites. And remember, Du Bois is writing, I think, in 1908, and so this is he's talking about a survival mechanism, and we could argue quite convincingly that this continues to be a survival mechanism, because failing to understand how white Americans perceive them can have deadly consequences. And so Du Bois argues that this develops in African Americans what he calls a double consciousness, having to be conscious of your own individual subjecthood, but also perceptions from the outside world, perceptions of a racist, white supremacist world that constantly imputes meaning onto black bodies, regardless of what that black individual might be doing. And this, of course, is an enormous expenditure of psychic energy, of psychic resources, of mental faculties. But it I would argue continues to be necessary for successfully navigating a white dominated world. And so that's what that's part of Du Bois's offering. Racism as a kind of veil, as this obscuring, obfuscating force, and double consciousness as this this tactic, this technique that African Americans have developed over the course of centuries as a means of surviving in a deeply racist world. Now, Get Out brings us to a very different place, right? A contemporary United States, where Chris is dating Rose. Chris is for those of you who haven't seen it, please go see it ASAP. Chris is a black guy dating Rose, a white woman, and the story unfolds in Rose's childhood home, where her parents are part of. Well, I won't spoil the film. Suffice it to say, Chris ends up in the sunken place, right? Chris is hypnotized by Rose's mother and sent into what she calls the sunken place. And there's a scene in the film where Chris's body is careening into this absolute black emptiness as Rose's mother kind of shrinks off in the distance. Um, we can think of that scene not simply as sort of metaphorical of what happens to Chris. It's not simply a kind of depiction of the kind of zombification of the black characters in the film, but it's vital to remember that Chris is a photographer, right? Chris is and the desire for Chris's body has to do with his eye, and so Jordan Peele is playing very keenly on perception, on eyes, on seeing as vital components to racism in the contemporary United States. And we can think of that scene where Chris is falling and Rose's mother is shrinking off into the distance as the narrowing of the aperture on a camera, right? The closing off of an aperture. And apertures, of course, control what light gets filtered in and not. And so we can think of the sunken place as kind of, in some ways, analogous to Du Bois's veil, right? This middle place, this in-between place, this interstitial space, where Chris is not in control of how he's being perceived. And that lack of control is dangerous. That lack of control is central to the horror of the film. And so the sunken place, of course, is not a literal place. It's not a literal place in Du Bois's theory, of course, but it's not a literal place in the film either. We can think of it as a kind of structure of consciousness, a place where you are so caught up, you are so controlled by white, as an African American person in the United States, by white perceptions of your blackness, of your black body, that you effectively become dispossessed of it, right? So that's how I think. I think Jordan Peele is brilliant. He's obviously incredibly well read. He has a filmic and comedic genius, and we see that in the work he's done in Jordan Peele, or rather Key and Peele, most certainly in Get Out, and his involvement in other projects. But I have a hard time thinking that this isn't in some way intentional, and I think that a Du Boisian reading of Get Out offers, I think, a rich analysis of contemporary racism. And I encourage you to think of theory in that way, as an interpretive lens, as a means of making sense of the world. And in that regard, you can use particular theoretical lenses to make sense of popular culture, to make sense of YouTube videos, to make sense of memes. And in that sense making, say something really critical and important about the world. And so Get Out, of course, it's fantasy and fiction, but good fantasy and good fiction use real life and tell us something about real life. Otherwise, it would be total nonsense, right? If fiction couldn't hinge on something that we could relate to, it would lose its meaning. It would lose its power. A sort of real life case study, I think, of this Du Boisian dynamic is the death of Trayvon Martin. Trayvon Martin, for those of you who don't know, was a 17-year-old black boy living in Sanford, Florida, who was shot by George Zimmerman, a community watch captain, in 2012. Zimmerman was armed legally with a Kel-Tec 9mm pistol, and Trayvon was making his way back to the home of his father's girlfriend after having gotten some snacks. Famously, now a can of Arizona iced tea and a bag of Skittles. Zimmerman, as as I've come to understand it, the community had been subject to a number of robberies and break-ins and property crimes. And Zimmerman called the police because he thought that Trayvon, a hooded 17-year-old black boy, was casing out houses, was peering into homes. He calls the police to report Martin's suspicious behavior, and he's following Trayvon as he does this. And the police dispatcher asks him just that: "Are you following him?" To which he tells him, to which Zimmerman says, "Yes, he is." And the dispatcher tells him that he didn't need to do that. That he didn't need to follow Trayvon. He needed just to wait for police to arrive. And of course, as we now know, Zimmerman did not cease to follow Trayvon. And while there's continues to be debate around the death of Trayvon Martin, and those of you who elect to write your extended analysis papers on the final week of class might choose to read my paper on my own research on the death of Trayvon Martin. What we do know for certain is that a violent encounter ensued between Trayvon and Zimmerman, one that resulted in George Zimmerman shooting Trayvon Martin twice in the chest. At which point, Trayvon died. Now, so how can we connect Trayvon Martin dying to Du Bois's ideas? Well, Du Bois is talking about double consciousness, right? The having to negotiate how you're perceived and your own sense of self constantly, and the deadly consequences that are born out of not being possessed entirely of how you're perceived, right? And of course, none of us are. I'm wearing a Penn State hat as I lecture to students enrolled at Syracuse University, right? I have no control over how you might perceive that. We are all subject to the perceptions of other people. But when we live in societies that are structured around particular kinds of inequalities, right? Racism, sexism, misogyny, homophobia, etc., certain perceptions can be deadlier than others. And so one has to imagine that Trayvon Martin had spent a great deal of his life juggling, being doubly conscious, juggling who he thought himself to be in his own sort of complex individuality and how he was perceived by other people. And I argue in my research that given the stereotypes of black men and boys in particular that continue to circulate in our society, it didn't matter for Zimmerman what Trayvon's intentions were, because he was so conditioned to see him in a particular way as a criminal. So that's Du Bois. Again, it's like with Weber, like with Marx. This is a SparkNotes version of his ideas, and there's just so many more things that could be said about Du Bois. There's so many more things that could be said, most certainly, about Get Out and the death of Trayvon Martin. But I hope that this week's lectures have been a kind of cross-section of social theory, give you a sense of how we use it, of the questions that we pursue, of its value, of its importance. And I hope you get to thinking about what kinds of things you might want to theorize, and what kinds of social problems you might pursue.